He thought it would be a normal drive home. A quiet night, an empty road, nothing out of the ordinary. But the moment those flashing lights appeared behind him, everything shifted. Suddenly, every past headline, every warning, every fear became real. The officer's tone, his look, his assumptions. They told a story long before any words were spoken. And what happened next didn't just change the night. It revealed a truth the officer never expected to face. Marcus Bennett lived a life built on discipline, fairness, and an unshakable belief in doing what was right. As the head of internal affairs, he spent his days reviewing complaints, holding officers accountable and trying, often quietly, often alone, to push the system towards something better. But off-duty, he was just Marcus, a father, a mentor, a man who enjoyed late-night drives to clear his mind after long, draining shifts. That night was supposed to be one of those drives. He left the office later than usual, loosened his tie, and let the hum of the engine melt away the stress of another stack of case files. The city lights faded behind him as he took the long road home, the one lined with tall trees and quiet intersections. Nothing about it felt unusual. In fact, the stillness was almost comforting. But sometimes danger doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it hides in moments that feel the safest. As Marcus turned onto the main stretch, a patrol car idled in a dark corner of the lot. He barely noticed it, just another officer finishing paperwork or running plates. Yet something about the way the headlights flicked on, the way the car eased out behind him, felt intentional, subtle, slow. He checked his mirrors, more out of habit than fear, but the unease settled anyway. He didn't know it yet, but the officer behind him wasn't just running a routine stop. He wasn't looking for a broken taillight or a drifting lane. He was looking at Marcus and seeing only what he wanted to see, and that single assumption would set everything else in motion. The patrol car crept closer, its grille filling Marcus's mirror like a silent warning. He tried to shake the feeling. He'd done nothing wrong, and he'd handled hundreds of these cases before. Still, experience had taught him that sometimes the most dangerous encounters were the ones rooted in assumptions, not actions. The flashing lights suddenly burst to life, splashing red and blue across the empty road. Marcus pulled over calmly, easing the car onto the shoulder. His breath hovered between steady and tense, the way it did before difficult interviews at work. He reached for his wallet, moving slowly, deliberately, every motion purposeful. A door slammed behind him. Heavy footsteps approached. Fast, too fast. Marcus kept his eyes forward. He could hear the officer's breathing, sharp and forceful, as if preparing for a threat that didn't exist. The beam of a flashlight cut through the window, bouncing off Marcus's hands. License and registration. The voice wasn't neutral. It was coded with suspicion, the kind that wasn't earned but assumed. Marcus handed over the documents without a word. Silence followed. Then the officer stepped back, circling the car as though inspecting a crime scene. The light traced the edges of the vehicle, lingering longer than needed, searching for something, anything to justify the stop. Minutes passed. Then the officer returned, tension radiating off him. "There's an issue with your plates," he said flatly. Marcus knew that was a lie. He renewed them 2 weeks ago. He opened his mouth to explain, but the officer cut in, voice firmer, colder. "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus hesitated, not because he feared being searched, but because he knew that hesitation, even a second of it, could be misread. He unlocked the door and stepped out slowly. The night air felt heavier now, thick with unspoken danger. The officer squared his stance, hand hovering near his holster. "Where are you headed?" "Home," Marcus replied, steady but cautious. "At this hour?" Marcus didn't flinch. "After work." The officer scoffed quietly, shaking his head as if the answer were impossible. He looked Marcus up and down, studying him with the same look Marcus had seen countless times in complaints. An officer convinced of a threat just because of the man standing in front of him. The officer ordered him to stand by the trunk while he radioed something in. Marcus could hear the murmurs, the coded language, the words "possible suspect" and "matches description." His chest tightened. There it was, the assumption becoming a narrative. Another unit was requested. Marcus's heartbeat quickened. He wasn't scared for his life. He was scared for how easily this moment could spiral, how quickly a story could be rewritten by the wrong person with the wrong perception. The second car approached, tires crunching against gravel. 2 more officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts. Their eyes locked on Marcus with the same doubtful stare. He realized then that he wasn't being questioned. He was being profiled, judged, defined by a picture that had nothing to do with him. And as the officers closed in, forming a loose circle around him, Marcus knew one thing with absolute certainty. This night was far from over. The 3 officers tightened their formation, closing the distance until Marcus could feel their presence pressing against him like a wall. Flashlights shook in their hands, their beams slicing through the darkness, jittery with anticipation. The first officer, the one who initiated the stop, stepped forward, jaw clenched, eyes burning with a certainty that had nothing to do with the truth. "Turn around." Hands on the trunk. Marcus didn't argue. He moved slowly, placing his palms flat on the cool metal. But the moment he did, a hard shove pinned him in place. His breath hitched. He'd reviewed cases just like this, cases where the slightest reaction was tray. Another officer began searching him, rougher than necessary, muttering under his breath as though already convinced he'd find something criminal. They found nothing. They never would. But instead of easing off, the first officer grew more agitated, pacing behind Marcus, fueled by a frustration he didn't try to hide. "You driving around this late? What are you really doing out here?" Marcus kept his voice calm, steady. "Going home, like I said." The officer snapped. "Don't play smart with me." He grabbed Marcus's arm, twisting it with sudden force. Pain shot up his shoulder, sharp and unexpected. Marcus staggered, catching himself before he fell, but the officers reacted instantly. Hands went to holsters. Fingers hovered over triggers. The world froze. In that split-second stillness, Marcus felt the weight of every story he had ever investigated. Every man who had stood in this same terrifying pause between fear and fate. He knew that one wrong assumption, one twitch, one frightened reaction, could end everything. Then the first officer barked into his radio, frustration cracking through his voice. "Dispatch, run him again. There's something off." Static. A pause. Then the reply, calm, clipped, unmistakably official. Subject identified. Marcus Bennett, head of internal affairs. The officers went still. The flashlight beams lowered. Breathing stopped. And in that sudden, eerie quiet, Marcus slowly turned his head, not in anger, but in something far heavier. Because now, the truth had finally caught up to them. The silence that followed the officer's realization felt heavier than all the shouting that came before it. Marcus didn't move, didn't speak. He simply straightened himself, letting the weight of the moment settle on the men who moments earlier had seen him as nothing more than a threat. Their faces shifted, from aggression to confusion to something like fear. Not fear of him, but fear of what they had just done. The officers stumbled over their words, offering shaky explanations, blaming the system, the night, the misunderstanding. But Marcus had heard it all before. He had read these excuses in reports, seen them typed into case files, repeated in hearings. Tonight, he had lived them. He took back his license, dusted off his jacket, and looked each officer in the eye. Not with anger, but with the quiet, undeniable truth of someone who had spent his life fighting this exact battle from the inside. This, he thought, is why the work never ends. Marcus drove away, but the road didn't feel the same. The weight of the night pressed on him, not because of who he was professionally, but because of who he was personally. A black man stopped for no reason. A man who, without a title, might have become another name whispered in grief, shared in outrage, or mourned in silence. And that was the part that stayed with him. Not the fear, not the humiliation, but the realization of how close he came to becoming a story told by someone else. Another reminder of a reality too many already know. This wasn't just one incident. This was a mirror, a reflection of a truth we keep seeing, keep recording, keep witnessing, and still haven't fully confronted. So the question remains, how many more nights like this will pass before change becomes more than a promise and finally becomes a reality?